Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 10th module, the 10th chapter, the 10th week in Journalism 101, Critical Analysis of the Mass Media. And by now you know I'm Paul Trout. This week we talk about entertainment. Actually, we return to the discussion of entertainment, an item that was touched upon in earlier chapters. And just as we spent time last week talking about journalism, we move now to talk about a part of content across platforms, across media, that serves a number of functions in society and is also extremely lucrative. And so I really just want to talk for 10, 15 minutes about this topic and touch upon a few things in the chapter, but mostly draw from this chapter and give you some things to think about by reaching back a little bit into history and having you think about whether or not historical trends will help us think about what might go on in the future. So I've titled this little discussion, Functions, Fusions, and the Future. You'll read in this chapter about the important functions served up by entertainment. And of course, one of those functions, it sounds redundant, but one of those functions is entertainment. I'm a social scientist, does a lot of survey research, looking at the relationship between exposure to certain kinds of media content and people's attitudes and behaviors. I direct a lot of master's theses at UNLV over the years, students who are looking at those same kinds of things. We often use theories that include, as part of the things we're measuring, the reasons people give for why they like certain programming on television or why they like certain internet content. And entertainment is a large social science construct and is measurable and can be measured reliably. And it turns out for some theories that it is the most important construct among all others. Educational, social utility, escape, all these are functions that have been studied and researched by folks like myself. But entertainment, in terms of its predictive value, in terms of its importance in people's heads, tends to override all those other functions. So that's why I think we're talking about it in this chapter, and that's why we want you to think a little bit more about it. As I record this session, I'm on campus on Nevada Day holiday in 2013, and we have a conference on board for the next 2 days that our school is sponsoring, and we have scholars here from universities across the country, and in fact globally, who are here talking about convergence, technology, and education. And many of the sessions that I'm attending are talking about how evolving technologies are being incorporated and best practices that are evolving in terms of ways to, say, teach journalistic practices utilizing handheld or mobile technology. Some of these are highly theoretical, some of these very practical. Actually, some are also highly theoretical and practical because there's nothing more practical than a good theory. But one of the recurring themes that I'm thinking about as I sit in these sessions is what's on the screen here in front of you. And that's how technology institutions and institutions defined as both industry, the people who are in the business of manufacturing content, including entertainment content, and policy regulators, the industries that you've been reading about all semester that regulate what technology can do and where it can do it, how much it can do it, in terms of radio, in terms of television, in terms of the internet, in terms of frequency and bandwidth, refresh rate, and all those kinds of things. Okay, how all those folks get meshed up with each other and as a result provide platforms for the distribution of content, and of course that creative element comes into play that combine to create new forms of entertainment. Or do they? And so in terms of talking about fusions, I want to illustrate that point further by discussing a few things historically with an eye toward what might this impinge in terms of our future. There are all kinds of cases going back to the advent of the printing press as a technology that we could talk about, but one of the fusions I want to discuss here in terms of the interplay between technology, institutions, industry, policy regulators, and talent is the model provided or exemplified in the fusion of radio and 60s music. This pulls from some things that you've had in a number of chapters thus far. So remember that flat disc recording that started in the early 20th century had evolved to a point where most people by the 1950s, 1960s in this country had one of two types of record players. They either had record players that played 45s, or they had record players that played LPs, which were longer, larger discs. Remember also that the television industry was growing by the 1950s and taking over the function that had been served by long-form, hour-long or half-hour-long radio programming that had been served up by the major networks in this country prior to that time. Those networks were now moving to television. And so because of technological developments on the front, say, for television, that impacted radio. Also, radio was desperately trying to find programming that it hadn't aired before because it could no longer use the stuff that was coming down from networks because they had been abandoned by the networks. So they were desperately seeking stuff to put out over the air. So the record industry provides an opportunity in terms of playing records and eventually tapes and eventually CDs and now digital copies or digital files. So television comes along, recording technology evolves. The FCC requires AM and FM stations to start separating their signal because up to that point, AM radio stations also owned FM stations, but they were just airing the same stuff that they were producing for their AM channel. But eventually in the 60s, the FCC said, nope, you can't do that simulcasting anymore. You've got to come up with new stuff. And so for my generation, we began to listen more and more to these FM stations because they were higher quality for the technical reasons that we've discussed in earlier chapters. And they also wanted to put stuff on the air that would fill airtime. So they would just play complete LPs. And of course, this catered to a youth generation. This catered to a music trend in terms of the initial rock and roll era, the British invasion, our own musical talents that were beginning to see an opportunity to rush into the music scene and provide something that radio was going to play for them, thus promoting their music, and hopefully the rest is history for some of these people in terms of creating superstar careers. So you have this fusion of recording technology, regulatory changes that are being imposed on radio by the FCC, people with artistic talent who see opportunities, and everything comes together at the right time, essentially, to create demand for something and fill a void that FM needed to fill. Thus, and they discovered there was this market, this youth market out there that wanted to listen to album-oriented rock. That's where we get that, because literally DJs at that time were playing and flipping over and playing in complete sides of albums. Okay. An example of technology, institutions, industry, and policy regulators and talent coming together to create new forms of entertainment. Let's move forward in time. Your generation has pretty much grown up with a vast array, multi-channel television environment where you watch a lot of different things on a lot of different channels, and you're used to having a lot of different channels. Now remember, cable technology came along as a solution to and as a competitor to television. And if you look at the regulatory battles going back and forth between broadcasters and cable, the pendulum had swung, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to favor cable because cable was in its infancy. So cable the FCC said to cable, go forth and prosper, essentially, and created all kinds of opportunities for that industry to grow. Technology came into play and moved away from coaxial cable, provided fiber optic technology that allowed cablers to put a heck of a lot more programming down the wire, down the cable, than they had before, which expanded channels and created new channels for the first time that began to grow first in the 80s and then in the 90s to these 100-plus channel arrays that we have now. And many of you have these kinds of systems at home, either on cable and now, of course, on satellite. Well, television's a voracious medium, and you can't just put a camera on the street scene and expect people to watch it. You've got to fill that up with programming. So folks, and we don't have a lot of money because of fragmenting audiences. Not that many people are watching any one channel, so we've got to come up with cheap programming. And so beginning in the 1980s, 1990s, and starting as spin-off programs to some of the kinds of things that Fox was doing, we began to see initially with, say, cop right around, at night watching cops arrest people kind of programs. But of course, that just created all these genres and subgenres and exploded it into the kind of reality television programming that we have today. So with cable expansion supported by the FCC and the voracious demand for programming, creative types came up with ideas for how to fill program time. And that's why we have so much reality TV today, because it's cheap. First and foremost, it's cheap. It's not always done particularly well, and to be sure, one looking at a television schedule will see tons of reality programming in there, and the sole reason there's so much is because it's extremely cheap to produce, even though most of us know it's not very good quality television. Production values are fine, but there's a lack of content there. So the fusion of TV channel expansion and the creation of reality TV is another example of what's going on here in terms of how technology, institutions, in this case the FCC, as regulators, created opportunities and demand for programming, and people who wanted to get into the production business looked around for cheap ways and came up with cheap ways to fill that program void. You can imagine how expensive it would be to create hour-long dramas and just continue to pump that kind of thing out, particularly when you have smaller audiences, because the advertising sold in these programs is not going to cover the expenses of those hour-long productions that some networks still do. So think about where you are today in your media environment. Think about how you use media. Think about the trends and evolution in handheld and mobile technologies that you pay so much attention to. And instead of just being users, I challenge most of you out there to begin to think as media majors, as journalism majors, what's happening on the technological front? What's happening in terms of policy and regulation? Be mindful of the fact that policy and regulation often come in after technologies have broken through. They're always catching up, trying to catch up to the latest developments. And they're often making policy decisions that are political, that aren't necessarily the best decisions for technology in terms of how to guide that industry. But based on the decisions that regulators, including the FCC, may make about handheld technology, about cellular technology, what implications does that provide in terms of opportunities for creative types like yourself? So history provides us with models. And forward-thinking people, forward-thinking media students, journalism students, need to be looking at trends in the industry, reading the trades, watching what goes on with technologies, and move from being passive users of that technology to forethinkers who are beginning to look at best practices that might be evolving 2, 3, 5 years down the road. Read this chapter, and you move forward into essentially the last third of the semester. Thanks for watching, and we'll get back to you with Module 11 in another week.